My name is Ashley Rendon, and I am the Deputy Director of Operations and Projects at the Pension Review Board. And I am here today with Amy Cardona. Though she's not speaking, we would be... Oh, sorry. She's our Executive Director, and we'd love to chat with you if you have specific questions about your plan. Also, I do have a questions portion at the end of my presentation. So if you may recall, this time last year, the PRB was at this conference bringing you the changes from the legislation. It was just about to be effective, I think maybe a couple days later. And in the spring, we presented at the TEXPERS conference on our rule concepts. And so today, we are going over our proposed FSRP rules and the coordinating policy. And hopefully we'll iron out that last bit. I know it's complex law. Okay, here is a general overview of my presentation. We'll talk about FSRP types. We'll get into that kind of alphabet soup that you might hear when we're talking about FSRPs. I will be saying FSRP a lot. We'll go over the proposed rules themselves. We'll cover the policy, and then we'll give a recap and answer questions. Okay, so for FSRP types, I wanted just to point out on this slide, I do have a link to our educational materials. We thought it might be helpful to have one-pagers that summarize each type of FSRP and provide different visuals like flow charts. I know it really helps us to figure all that out, and so hopefully it'll be helpful for you all. You can also find this information on our website. If you go to the home page, there's an actuarial drop-down, and then FSRP is there. If you click that, you can find our educational materials there too. So for a brief overview, the FSRP law was created in 2015 through House Bill, that should say 3310, from Representative Paul. And in 2021, that law was updated just last session through House Bill 3898. That was Representative Angia. And before we got into the specific types of FSRPs, I wanted to give you all a general kind of this goes for all FSRPs going forward type summary. And so for all FSRPs after September 1st, 2021, the funding period target is going to be 30 years or less. And there's a 2-year period for developing the FSRP. And before, in the old law, if you remember, it was 6 months. And so now there's a 2-year period. The deadlines for providing us updates and for, in general, submitting the FSRP is going to be using the valuation date. And so if you look at your actuarial valuation, it's typically the first day or the last day of your fiscal year. And once your FSRP is finished, there's an analysis that should be submitted as well. And so that could either be in an actuarial valuation or in a separate analysis, and it should show the combined impact of the changes that you're making and provide a projection to full funding. And then there's also an opportunity to become exempt from the revised FSRP, which I'll get into a little bit later. So we'll start with the legacy FSRP, or LFSRP. It's important to note right now there are only 5 systems that have an LFSRP, and there will not be any more than that. That's because when any FSRP that was submitted before September 1st, 2021 was kind of grandfathered, and so their 10-year period is able to play out. However, if, for example, your system was subject to the FSRP or revised FSRP and didn't get one turned in before September 1st, 21, then it would not have an LFSRP. So in order to keep that LFSRP status, those plans must adhere to the law before September 1st, 2021, and we are monitoring that with a compliance corridor. And that's new, it's in our rules, and I'll go over that a little bit later. onto our standard FSRP, or just the Funding Soundness Restoration Plan. If you hear FSRP by itself, this is the one we're talking about. This applies to FSRPs formulated after September 1st, 2021, and it would include those, like I talked about earlier, who were subject to the requirement before then, but didn't get one turned in before September 1st, 21. So the target funding period is now less than or equal to 30 years. And right now it has the same triggering mechanism as the old law, except you would replace 40 with 30. So after 2 or 3 consecutive actuarial evaluations showing a funding period over 30 years, that is when a plan would trigger an FSRP. There is at least 2 years to develop the FSRP, and I'm saying at least because if this requirement was triggered anytime kind of now through September 1st, 2023, you'd have up until 2025 to develop the FSRP. So those plans have a little bit longer. Otherwise, it's going to be 2 years to develop and implement the plan. So since it will take the 2 years, the required progress updates will be during that 2-year period. So it starts a year after that AV that triggered the requirement, and then every 6 months until it's submitted. Okay, also the FSRP must be adopted by the system and sponsor at open meetings. After you submit the FSRP, you must also submit an analysis, which can be in an AV or in a supplemental analysis that shows the asset and liability projection to full funding. And so there are 2 aspects to compliance. The first is to turn in kind of all the required documentation, and the second is to meet the rest of the statutory and rule requirements. And finally, once your FSRP is complete and submitted, the funding policy for the plan must also be updated to reflect the changes that you've made. So because you're doing an FSRP, there's going to be some necessary changes to the funding policy, and it's probably a good practice to do them kind of simultaneously. So for the revised FSRP, or our FSRP, I wanted to note that an R FSRP will always follow a standard FSRP. So if you're a plan with a legacy FSRP and you fall out of compliance, you won't be required to do immediately an R FSRP. It would be a standard FSRP targeting 30 years first. The revised FSRP requirement is triggered if a plan triggers another FSRP within 10 years of completing one. You still get 2 years to formulate the plan, and you have the same progress update as for the standard FSRP. And the biggest differences, right, is this is a more stricter requirement. So the target funding period is 25 years or less, and there are now required changes, such as automatic risk sharing mechanisms and an ADC structure. So there are 2 kind of avenues that will allow you to become exempt from the revised FSRP. And for both, first, the plan must have a funding period between 30 and 40 years. So that one, you hit that one first, and then either you're adhering to an FSRP formulated before September 1st, 2025, or the system is using or ultimately will use an ADC contribution structure and is expected to reach full funding. And so I did want to note that you can meet these requirements and become exempt from the revised FSRP requirement, but if you do trigger another FSRP, you would be required to do one that targets a standard. It would be a standard FSRP. It would target 30 years. So you kind of get another chance at that. Okay, and so finally, for the last type of FSRP is the voluntary FSRP, or VFSRP. So this is new, it's included in our rules, and the biggest advantage, I think, to doing a voluntary FSRP, besides proactively coming up with a plan to get your system's funding kind of sorted out, is to take advantage of the revision exemption. So this may be important for systems that kind of see it coming maybe after 2025. You can get that plan going and submit it beforehand and take advantage of, not having to adhere to those stricter requirements of the revised FSRP. If a system and its sponsor choose to develop a VFSRP, you'd follow the standard FSRP requirements, except for the progress updates. So you're not actually, since you're not actually required to do this, you don't have to adhere to those progress update requirements, though you can choose to keep us in a loop if you want. The funding period target would be equal to or less than 30 years, just like in the standard FSRP, and the analysis, or AV, must be submitted showing the projection to full funding. So this wraps up the FSRP types. Oops. And we will move on to the proposed rules. So like I mentioned a little earlier, we've been working on these rules for a while now, and we started back in January bringing initial concepts to our actuarial committee. We presented those to our full board in February, and in May, we presented the draft rules and updated policy to our actuarial committee. Last month, our board approved the draft rules, and they were published in the July 29th issue of the Texas Register. So, public comment will be accepted through August 29th. We'll take any comments to our board in October, and we hope they'll give their final approval then, and they'll be made effective 20 days after we submit them. So let's dive in. These first few sections are administrative. They provide the authority and purpose, the definitions that we use throughout these rules, and the applicability, of course, it would be any retirement system subject to an FSRP or any that would want to develop a VFSRP. So for membership notification, Government Code Section 802.106 requires all public retirement systems to send annual notices to their members. And also in that section, the retirement system must notify its members if the actuary determines that the financing of the system is inadequate. So our rule clarifies that if a plan receives an AV with a funding period greater than 30 years, the funding arrangement is inadequate. So that would mean that systems must notify their members of any AV that has a funding period over 30 years, and if they are subject to an FSRP. So to be clear, that would be not kind of on a receipt of the AV or anything like that. It would just be information included in the notification that you already send your members. Okay, so LFSRP compliance. How do we decide whether an LFSRP is adhering to their plan? We have established compliance corridors to help. So the old way of monitoring compliance was, as long as a plan's AV showed that the plan's funding period was consistently moving towards 40, then it would be considered compliant and adhering to its plan. The compliance corridors provide more flexibility, so if the funding period increases, so long as it stays within the corridor, so that's the yellow portion there on that chart, then they'd be considered compliant. So again, on this chart, the yellow portion is the corridor. It starts off at 10 years and narrows as the years go by. And then if your plan experiences positive, has positive experience that puts you outside, kind of in the blue, that is also okay. So those are kind of, you could say that's the safe zone. If there are two compliance corridors. So there's one for funding periods and there's one for funded ratios. For LFSRP plans, if you are able to use the funded ratio corridor if you submit a projection to us. Okay, and for revision, LFSRP completion, so if you're a plan with an LFSRP, it will be considered completed once the plan reaches the original target date or once the AV shows a funding period under 30 years. So, for example, as of the time we were putting this together, there were 5 systems with LFSRPs, and we did receive an AV from Irving Fireman's Relief and Retirement Fund, and if we haven't yet reviewed it, but if that AV shows them below 30 years, and that would be funding period can use the market value of assets or actuarial value of assets. So once it reaches below 30, then we can consider them completed, take them off the list, and we'll be down to 4 plans. So revision exemption. So this one is more just technical in nature, and so it's simply stating if an LFSRP system can qualify for the revision exemption as well. That would be once the LFSRP is completed. So here's some more on compliance, but this is for the new or the standard FSRPs. So this is kind of the documentation. Each FSRP would need to submit a cover sheet, and that would be that's something that we're working on providing for you all. Then anything necessary that you would want to include as explanatory materials. So that would be kind of the meat of the FSRP itself. And then documentation that the FSRP has been adopted by the system and the sponsor. And that could be something like meeting minutes or other type of document that shows that it was adopted in an open meeting. And so the FSRP will be considered complete once that actuarial evaluation or supplemental analysis is submitted. This section of the rules also has the definition of automatic risk sharing and for our FSRPs, and it includes that the PRB actuary will check on whether the methods used in the FSRP are consistent with the actuarial standards of practice. Okay, for progress updates, systems that were subject on September 1st, 2021, and that are not LFSRP plans would be required to provide their first update by September 1st, 2023. The first draft, and this is for all plans, the first draft of an FSRP should at least include a planned timeline to complete the FSRP. And any description of changes should include the actuarial impacts of each change. And again, voluntary FSRPs do not need to provide, plans with voluntary FSRPs do not need to provide progress updates since they're not subject to the requirement. Okay, and this is the final slide of the rules regarding the revision exemption. So we'll also be using a compliance corridor compliance corridors for plans with new FSRPs to qualify for that revision exemption. And it states that the system must adhere to an FSRP submitted before September 1st, 2025. It's essentially the same corridor as the LFSRP because you can trigger a revised FSRP within 10 years that you submit, from when you submit an FSRP. This section also has the VFSRP rules that allow plans to submit a VFSRP as long as it follows all of the compliance requirements. Okay, so on to the policy. The PRB has a policy right now based on the old FSRP statute, and we're updating that now to be the policy for promoting compliance with funding soundness restoration plan requirements. So it's going to completely replace the old policy, and it has elements of our non-compliant policy in it. So that includes the types of notifications we send out to plans concerning the FSRP and at various stages of the process. And it also provides our process for reporting FSRP updates to our board, late notifications, and further actions taken if a plan is non-compliant. We plan to formally adopt this policy at the next meeting of our full board in October. Okay, so we've covered the different types of FSRPs and gone through the rules and just touched on our policy. And the one last thing I have is just a reminder of the rules. They have been posted in the Texas Register, and we really appreciate, we've reached out to plans throughout the process and gotten some really good feedback really before we posted those rules. And so thank you all for that. And the comments, any comments will be accepted through August 29th. And so that concludes my presentation.